Rick Deckard. Ex-cop. Man of the Hour. Blade Runner. He's more than a brute.
He's a goddamn one-man slaughterhouse, that's what he is.
Deckard's a man who is morally unmoored from the start. He doesn't bother trying to justify his work. He endures it. He's a man whose ethical landscape has collapsed. He's just walking around in the ruins. And if he's not retiring replicants, well, then he's little people. Empathy is a virus for a guy like Deckard. It comes to infect him against his will. Empathy happens to him. He doesn't choose it. Empathy overwhelms his professional detachment. Empathy for Deckard's an existential hazard. Rachel, Pris, and Roy don't test him. They serve to undo him. Replicants are dangerous because they expose the emptiness in his soul. They're not counterfeit humans, they're intensified humans, and it ain't no joke. That's right, they are doing all the emotional labor for him. Deckard is destabilized not because they lack empathy, but because they appear to have more of it. Deckard is isolated and emotionally opaque. Authority is imposed on him, not embodied by him. His masculinity is deconstructed. He's passive, hesitant, and reactive. He's not a man with a job. He's a man being used by the job. His humanity is largely unresolved, even illusory. His crisis leads to ontological exile. Deckard may be cool and slick, but he's morally hollow. He may be more aesthetically appealing, but he's emotionally cold. He lacks curiosity about his own actions. He avoids moral responsibility rather than grappling with it. His passivity borders on ethical laziness. His treatment of Rachel is, at best, coercive and troubling. He doesn't argue for the system. He just shrugs and enforces it. True, he's visually iconic, but he's quiet, wounded, and potentially bored. In some ways, he may be seductive, and he gives a good impression.
Well, you'd be surprised what a guy go through to get a glimpse of a beautiful body.
But he's a vacuum into which the semblance of philosophy drips. The replicants are where the charisma, the vulnerability, and the ethical urgencies live. Deckard's not much of a hero. He functions as an agent of contrast, a human silhouette against which the artificial beings glow. Deckard isn't meant to be admired. He's meant to be outpaced. Rick Deckard is the ultimate protagonist of utility. He's functional for the narrative, but he's fundamentally grim for exploration. He is serviceable because he carries the mechanical efficiency required to track and retire his targets, acting as the necessary cleanup for a system that wants the garbage removed without having to look at the mess. Yet he remains unappealing because he lacks the moral spark, much less the physical dominance of a traditional hero. He spends the majority of the time getting brutally overpowered by his prey and emotionally hollowed out by his task. There's no glory in his work. It's all just a box of noodles. He's like a bony catfish operating in a moral gray zone, so murky that his primary defining trait is bone-deep exhaustion. In a world filled with vibrant, desperate replicants fighting for every precious second of life, Deckard often feels like the only person who's already given up on his.
Any discussion about Rick Deckard from the novel must begin with his obsession with animals. And make no mistake, he's not the only one who suffers from the condition. On his way to work as a bounty hunter for the SFPD, he stops by the pet shop to examine what he cannot have, and he's never alone. The world post-terminus is one where you know how people are, about not taking care of an animal. They consider it immoral and anti-empathetic. Trying to pin down exactly why this is can be mind-bending. It begins with Rick Deckard's life as a bounty hunter. It's his job. He hunts down androids and he retires them. But it doesn't help that his wife calls him a murderer. The moral, ethical quandaries that follow from the accusation are exponential. Rick's rationale is based on the notion that he believes, deep down, that androids are just machines. Isn't he correct? Killing them, retiring them, however you want to call it, it shouldn't be a problem. Nonetheless, he's got feelings to deal with on that note. He's not entirely certain. Luckily for him, Mercerism is there to help him with his uncertainty. The war's radioactive aftermath has killed animals, driven mass immigration, and made Earth a moral wasteland where life itself is rare enough to become sacred. In that sense, empathy has become scarce because its objects are scarce. There's nothing left to care for. In a world that is as spiritually as ruined as its ecology, Mercerism teaches that caring for animals, especially at great personal cost, is one of the clearest outward signs of a moral self. But Rick's ability to express empathy, and thus his ability to feel moral, collapses when the animal that he cares for dies of tetanus. How is he supposed to feel about himself and his actions without concurrently acting in a manner that makes him feel moral? If he's killing androids and going home to a wife who calls him a murderer, how is he supposed to paper over the cracks? The answer is simple. By caring for a replacement sheep that is an electronic sheep. That's how. But it isn't real, is it? Which must mean that the empathy he extends isn't real either. It's all just an act. Rick Deckard is caught in a vicious loop in which real animals are too expensive, and for the money, he's forced to retire more androids for the bounty, thus fueling the chain of dubious morality. And so he marches around conducting himself in his job with a catalog of animals for sale, breaking it out at various times of the day to figure on when he will finally make that purchase, all for the sake of his mental health. And the obsession pays off when he finally buys a true-to-life flesh and blood goat. Why isn't it working anymore? The guilt doesn't lift, the empathy doesn't settle, and his inner fragmentation actually accelerates. Killing an android shouldn't be this complicated. Even Mercerism has taught him that it was perfectly acceptable to sense evil without understanding it. For Deckard, with Mercer's approval, sensing evil meant destroying it, and destroying it meant cash. When he meets up with Rachel Rosen, the moralities of his mind really take a baking. During the time span leading up to the encounter, he's retired Polikoff and witnessed the nasty destruction of 2 other androids. And Luba Luft was an android who seems as though she didn't really deserve to go like that. Luba isn't just an android. She's cultured, she's articulate, and she's publicly known as an opera singer. Rick's revulsion at the killing isn't theoretical, it's visceral and punishing, and he has to live with having enabled it. The compression of these events has done enormous psychological work. He's overloaded mentally, and it's for Rachel to venture into the wreckage. Rachel doesn't start Rick's breakdown. She exploits a fault line that's already open. Rachel is seductive, yes, but not fluidly human. Her charm is effortful, almost procedural. She talks too much. She pushes intimacy forward mechanically, and she performs desire rather than inhabiting it. And Rick notices. That's what makes her so destabilizing. She doesn't seduce him by illusion. She seduces him as he's feeling off. Rachel is loquacious because it floods the space where Rick's moral reasoning had once been operating. She reframes, she distracts, she personalizes, and she eroticizes. She doesn't argue ethics. She replaces ethical inquiry with intimacy. And Rick allows her, not because he believes her, but because he's exhausted from cross-referencing every moral system he's been relying on. This is why the encounter breaks him rather than enlightens him. Rick doesn't fall for Rachel because she's convincing. He falls for her because his evaluative machinery is shot. He's just witnessed deception masquerading as authority, law turning arbitrary, and beauty dying meaninglessly. By the time Rachel offers herself, Rick's already gone off the rails. Experience has acted on Rick faster than reflecting on it can keep up. Rachel isn't the cause, she's the accelerant. She arrives at the exact moment when Rick can no longer tell whether empathy is insight or liability, whether desire is connection or surrender. Rick is not being seduced into clarity, but into further fragmentation. Rachel's trip to San Francisco was never meant to resolve Rick's ethical crisis. By the time the encounter has come to a close, we find that she is the master of its incarnation.
By the time it's all over, the moral of the story doesn't even quite gel. Rick experiences empathy for a toad only to find the toad isn't even real. Iran decides to care for it anyways. Here, the temptation to reduce the ending to the notion that artificiality is irrelevant, that empathy matters in its expression at all costs, is strong, but it should be refused. Rick's epiphany, if we can call it that, is not a clean revelation. It's not enlightenment. It's not synthesis. It isn't philosophical closure. It's better understood as a collapse of a hierarchy, followed by the smallest possible ethical remainder. Artificiality does indeed become symbolically irrelevant, but only in a very narrow and painful sense. What Rick realizes, and even that word may be too generous, is not that artificial things are as good as real ones, nor that distinctions don't matter. Rather, he confronts the fact that his capacity to care does not depend on the authenticity of the object. The feeling precedes the ontology. He mourns the toad before knowing it's electric, and that mourning was real, and thus, it has significance. But this realization does not redeem the system that has taught him otherwise. It doesn't undo the killing. It doesn't restore mercerism. It doesn't reconcile him with Iran, Rachel, or himself. It simply strips away the last illusion, that correctness of category guarantees correctness of action. That's why we resist calling the novel's ending a single statement with a moral. There is no slogan-level claim. What's happened is something messier and more unsettling. Biological essentialism, the real versus the artificial, has been dismantled without endorsing the anything goes framework of moral relativism, and without offering a replacement framework sturdy enough to stand on its own. What remains is not doctrine, but residue. Notions of care persists even after belief systems fail, not triumphantly, not heroically, just stubbornly and inconveniently. Rick's final condition matters here. He's exhausted, hallucinatory, and ethically smeared. If this were a philosophical epiphany, it would clarify him. Instead, it leaves him diminished, and it tells us something crucial. It's a realization not really worth celebrating. What kind of world is it that forces ethical insight to arrive after all the damage has been irreparable and done? If there is a statement to be made, it's a provisional one. It's to suggest that if moral feeling is real, even when the systems built to justify or regulate it are false, recognizing the fact does not heal the harm these systems enable. Rick Deckard doesn't learn a lesson and move on. He survives the collapse of meaning with a single fragile practice still intact: extending care, even when it no longer proves anything, redeems anything. It's not an epiphany in the classical sense. It's what's left when epiphanies are no longer trustworthy.
What distinguishes the two Deckards most sharply is not their competence or even their morality, but the direction in which artificial intelligence presses up against them. And you can take that one to the bank. In the novel, Rick Deckard experiences android intelligence as an external pressure on a fragile human moral system that he is trying to maintain, with mixed results. Androids unsettle him because they threaten to hollow out the steady bureaucratic notion of empathy that defines human worth in his world. It's tedious business. His response is anxious, theological, and procedural. He leans harder on tests, categories, and moral accounting, even as these tools begin to fail him. Artificial intelligence in Rick's world is not seductive or revelatory. It is destabilizing precisely because it mimics human behavior without participating in human obligation. His struggle is not to distinguish himself from machines, but to justify why the distinction should continue to matter at all. By contrast, the film's Deckard encounters artificial intelligence as an inward force that erodes his sense of self rather than it being a problem to be solved. Replicants do not simply challenge his authority, they expose the scarcity of his interior life, and it's kind of sad. Where the novel's Deckard responds to AI by doubling down on institutional definitions of humanity, the film's Deckard responds by withdrawing, hesitating, and finally yielding ground that leaves him with a broken finger. For real, that crazy bastard broke Deckard's finger. For what it's worth, artificial intelligence in Blade Runner does not demand better tests or clearer rules. It demands emotional reckoning, and that is something Deckard is ill-equipped to meet. His response is not philosophical resistance, but quiet displacement, as the replicants assume the role of meaning makers while he becomes increasingly peripheral to the ethical drama. Taken together, the two Deckards illustrate a shift in cultural anxiety about artificial intelligence itself. Rick Deckard belongs to a moment concerned with systems, criteria, and moral inadequacy, how to preserve humanity when it can be measured, simulated, and economically gained. Blade Runner's Deckard belongs to a later moment, one more haunted by interior emptiness and affective collapse, where the dangers of artificial intelligence lies not in its lack of empathy, but in its capacity to make vapid humans visible. The one fears that machines will erode humanity's moral authority. The other fears, without entirely articulating it, that humanity has already done so on its own. Heaven help us. And may God have mercy on our souls.